Hello and welcome. It's me, Percita, and this is Percita's Paradox. Thank you so much for joining me. I greatly appreciate you, your time, and effort in finding me on this thing called YouTube. If you're new to this channel, thank you so much for joining me. I greatly appreciate you. And if you're an OG, you know the drill. Thank you, as always, for your continued support. So here we are, top of the week. Very interesting week already. The weekend was very interesting. But moving beyond that, I definitely want to deal with just what I think a lot that's going on in regards to the idea of where our emotions are, right? And you might say, well, what are you talking about? Well, I'm not going to get into like the idea specifics of what I could be saying because, you know, if you're catching me when you're catching me, then you kind of already know what I'm going to be talking about. And if you're not, then you'll pick up on it later. Let me say it like that. I am a keen, idealistic person in regards to privacy, and I'm not the type of person that wants to always get into what I like to call the minutia of gossip. But I think there's some key points on some things that I would love to touch on today, and I just want to make it a part of that. So what I want to deal with is just the ideology of what facade actually is. And when I think about the word facade and we think about what it could mean in the aspects of just the physicality of it, meaning, something that absolutely is overshadowing or blocking the true identity or image of something or someone. When I think of that, I definitely want to talk about just what that actually means and how to break down our facades, especially coming off of the idea of building a better relationship for us females to get together. So my last video, that's what I was talking about. I was really kind of hitting you on this idea that I was ready to break down my facade. Now, I didn't really say facade, but I just think this is a perfect opportunity to jump on board and really address ways to break down facades that we have. Now, let's be very clear. Fear is what really is the proponent and the foundation for all of these issues that go on in our life. So with that being said, trying to actually appraise how we cope and what we actually perceive threat to be is really the issue of what protective motivation theory type logic would be. It just so happens that that's where I am in my studies. And I thought what a great opportunity to come and talk to you all in the masses about it because it's just a really interesting perception. So today, the question is, how do we break down our facades to actually become the best us that we can become? So again, the question is, how do we break down our facades? So number one, we really have to identify what exactly the threat is, right? And you may say, okay, well, what do you mean? What is the threat? And we all have some sense of what our fears are being aroused by. Like, what exactly are we really feeling the fear about? I don't think we think about that a lot. I think we really kind of go into this idea of like, I'm everything, I'm every woman, I can overcome it all, because it's just not what society allows us to do. And you may say, well, girl, didn't you tell us that we need to move past society and what its encompassment of what we are defined to be is? Of course. But I'm a realist, and I'm going to tell you that we still live in this world. Instantaneously when something happens, it's reported. I come from an era where you could actually have a facade. I don't really think you can even really have a facade at this point because things are just so quick and they're so quickly reported and they're so quickly identified and you're so quickly described and kind of put in a niche or pocket before you can even really figure out what a facade is. Before us older people, you may say, girl, what do you mean you're not that old? I'm old enough to tell you that there was no internet happening when I was growing up. Therefore, it gave us room to have a facade. It gave us room to try to build into a personality or trait that we may want to possess, right? Maybe we haven't, but you wouldn't know it quite as quick. Prime example. Back in the day, before I understood how finances worked, and I'm going to say that with that clause attached, I could write a bad check and it would take a good 3-4 weeks before the bank could find out. Now, child, you don't even write the check. You can write a check, hand the person the check, they will scan the check. The check will then identify to that merchant if you even have any money in the bank, let alone being able to bounce a check. So if you're bouncing checks right now, you are doing some phenomenal work. Because typically, if you catch what I'm saying, the facade of having money in the bank based on the tender of the instrument of a check, used to be the ability to create a facade of having the money. But that's not the case anymore, because you're actually able to identify that quick then and in a hurry. It's the same when it comes to who you are. So if you are in the era that I'm coming from, then you still may be functioning in that capacity. So trying to sustain that in an environment now that does not really allow that, you can see how it can get a little tricky and how it can be so overwhelming for people that are in my era. Because most of us, in the late 40s, let's just be honest, if you're on the internet, then you are calling yourself up to par, you are calling yourself tech savvy, and you are feeling pretty good. But truth be told, we are still struggling to find things on the internet and how to use our phones properly. I would say that most of the people in my age bracket haven't even actually taken the time to read the actual manuals that come with their cell phones. To be perfectly honest with you, I just found out that there is that kind of information that comes in the little box of the Apple phone. Girl, didn't even know. So, whole nother story. But I say all of that to say it's just so different. So when you want to break it down, you have to think about what's the threat of, like, why are you even creating a facade? Why is it something that you don't feel like you can actually expose or be okay with the exposure? Typically, it has to do with the acceptance. So number 2, you have to deal with what the fear is. Standardly, I will tell you it's something to do with acceptance of some form or another. And again, this is where it becomes a little tricky, because you don't really understand that that's what it is. It really gets justified in our heads for a whole lot of other reasons. Instead of us really understanding that there's really not much that most of us go through that another person in our circle has not gone through, will go through, or is in the same process of right now. We tend to think, because fear makes you think you're the only person going through it. You're the only individual in that situation. It's why we're so heavily speaking now about mental health and how exactly that should work, and what leeway and what gauge we should use in really dealing with people. And even that's funny, because everyone's going to then have their own perspective about whatever it is. So there's yet again the next point, which would actually be number 3, is that you have to be okay with understanding it's not going to be okay with everyone. Isn't that kind of crazy? But truth be said, facades can be described and, literally defined and initiated by people for a plethora of reasons. And sometimes people don't want to say it's fear. You don't even actually want to use the word fear, because you think fear then causes you to be defeated. Fear doesn't cause you to be defeated. Your mindset about fear is what causes you to be defeated. But what if I told you that some won't even identify that, because the idea is just too much for them? They want to feel like they overcome and can do everything. And this is where I start to say to people, like, you really have to understand that you're trying to protect yourself. The reason why you're having the idea of the threat is that you're trying to protect yourself out of the idea that you won't be able to do it. So the protective motivation kind of becomes convoluted, because you're trying to figure out how much of it do you know? What self-efficacy is it that you can lean on to know how to get yourself out of it? That leads us to this very cool idea of coping. And when you're dealing with that coping, you find yourself trying to figure out exactly what it is you have mastered and what you haven't mastered, in order to figure out how to actually achieve a better outcome for the threat. You may say, okay, well, you're saying all of those things. Give me an example. Okay, so a prime example of what I'm saying is that, the threat would be that you don't want to be, let's just say, obese, right? Let's just deal with fitness. You don't want to be fat, or you don't want to be able to not fit into your clothes. Well, that's the threat. The point is that how will you actually combat it by coping with it? Are you going to exercise? Are you going to eat less? Are you going to walk more? Like, what is it that you're going to do? When you think about the facade in life, then you have to ask yourself, once you've identified the threat, what are you going to do in order to cope with it, instead of actually trying to put yourself in a space of continuing to fear and create facade after facade, instead of just actually attacking the issue, coping with it, understanding why you have it, and then trying to fix it so that you don't have the fear about it anymore. You hear me say all the time, like, addressing things is really the key. Now, I'm not the type of person that really wants to tell you that you want to always argue with people or situations or even yourself, but I am about being as honest as possible. Now, let's be really clear. You don't ever want to put yourself in a position where you feel as if your honesty is going to harm you or someone else, because you want to really be very cautious about the way you time something, meaning you could do the right thing at the wrong time. It does not negate from the fact that it's the right thing, but the timing of some things is everything. Even in regards to fear, you could fear something because you are not prepared for whatever it is, but 5 seconds later you could be great. Meaning you could fear fire as you're hearing yourself cut on the eye of the stove because you hear it ticking. But the moment that it cuts on, your next fear could be that you're going to burn yourself because it's turned up too high. But as soon as you identify that you can just slow down, really assess what's going on and see the knob, turn the knob, and actually bring the flame down into a place where you don't feel fear, then you understand the timing of what you just did was just how your fear aroused and what it was literally being built on instead of just slowing down and actually assessing. So I say a lot of that because I want you to understand that most of your threat comes from your timing. Most of it comes from the idea that you're really not allowing yourself time to assess it. So you hear me say all the time, stop, actually think about what it is. Think about what you're fearing. Think about what's the worst that could happen in said situation, and then make your assessment, and then come up with an idea of a cope and attack it. Why do I say that? Because there's no way to get around fear. That's just a part of what life is. It's going to be fearful. If it was not fearful, then literally what would be the gauge? If there was no right, how would there be a wrong, right? If there was no God, how would there be people who actually said that there isn't a God? I mean, atheists can't literally exist unless they believe that something didn't actually exist. So you'd have to believe it existed to believe that it didn't exist, right? But that's deep. So I won't go too deep. I'm going to stick on to what I'm saying. But you understand where I'm trying to go, hopefully. You understand that I'm trying to say it's just not worth the idea anymore of letting fear just be your coping mechanism. See how I flipped that on you? So you can't let your fear be your cope, meaning you can't allow yourself to walk in this idea that you're just going to be fearful, and being fearful is the way that you address everything in life, because guess what will happen? You won't do anything. Guess what else will happen? You'll become resentful in yourself. You'll spin off and you'll be upset and envious and narcissistic and manipulative towards people because you're just simply jealous on what it is that they're willing to do. Everyone fears. It's just the way that you cope with it is what determines how deep that will be rooted into what it is that you're doing. And I'm proposing today, in order to get rid of the facade, it's just you simply have to cope better with the fear. Instead of thinking that it's going to go away, the matrix in life is to really understand you have to be content in what you're in as you're trying to grow to be something bigger. Did you catch that? So you can't really be so content that you're not moving and so fearful that you don't move. You still have to know that what you've achieved is wonderful, but I've yet to meet a person who's saying, you know what, this is great, I'm going to stay right here. We say it and we actually don't even understand that that's not even what we mean. Meaning I've never met a person who's going to say, you know, more success would be bad for them. Or, you know what, I don't want anything else, right? Even in regards to food, it's very seldom that you meet someone that's just like, you know what, if it's good to them, let me clarify, that they don't want any more. Because that would actually mean that they don't want any more at that moment. But I've yet to see someone say like, well, that chicken was good on last Tuesday. I'm never going to eat that chicken again because it was so satisfying that I'll never want it again. If you love it, if you really enjoyed it, you wouldn't have a hard time in eating it again. When you eat it, back to timing, is a completely different dynamic, but you would not enjoy eating it, right? So just want you to be in a place of understanding that there are ways to break down your facade. There are ways to understand how the facade is working, and they all kind of coexist, and they all work within this appraisal of threat and appraisal of coping dynamic. It becomes a little bit more scientific, but for the most part, I think what I'm saying is enough for you to get the gist of it in order to move forward. So I use the example of fitness because, of course, at this point, I'm going to tag in, how are you doing in regards to the challenge? If you're on the challenge, hit me in the comments and let me know what you're doing with your food and meal plans and how you're coping with fears of whatever you have, from not being able to hit your goal, or from the idea that you're just not equipped to handle it right now, down to exactly how you're coping with even the things I just said. I would love to hear it. And if it's too personal, because God knows you guys get a little touchy-feely about that, you already know the drill. My email is also in the description. Hit me in my email box and let me know what's going on. Other than that, I just wanted to touch bases with you today and really give you some food for thought and kind of let my thoughts ramble out into this genre of the internet, but to also put you in a place to know that I'm thinking about you, and I want you to know that you don't need a facade to do anything in life. You are enough, and if you believe that, it will absolutely manifest. If you don't, then this is the idea of go back and listen to this video and figure out what the thread is that you feel and how you can cope with it better. So as always, before you do anything, know that you have to do 3 things. And those 3 things are live life authentic. As always, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you later in the week. As always, bye-bye.